In October of 1969, an auctioneer stood in a factory in Elk Grove Village, Illinois, and sold off the contents of two guitar companies at the same time. Not one, two. The tooling went first, then the jigs, then the woodstock, the pickup winding machines, the laminating presses that had shaped the tops and backs of millions of instruments over 4 decades. By the time the gavel fell for the last time that afternoon, the combined manufacturing infrastructure of the Kay Musical Instrument Company and the Valco Manufacturing Company, two of the largest guitar builders in American history, both Chicago-born, both giants of the mid-century market, had been reduced to a single auctioneer's lot number. It took one afternoon to sell what had taken 80 years to build. Here is what makes that afternoon strange. Kay and Valco were not partners. They were rivals. For more than 20 years, they had competed for the same dealers, the same catalog contracts, the same retail floor space, in the same American music stores. And yet, in the years before that auction, something had quietly changed between them. Something the trade press had not quite caught. Something the dealers had not quite understood. Kay had been buying its amplifiers from Valco. The rival was building the gear Kay sold under its own name. By 1967, when the two companies formally merged, they were already so entangled that no one could cleanly separate them. And when the imported Japanese guitars finished what the decade had started, they went down together. A decade earlier, the Kay Musical Instrument Company had been the second largest guitar manufacturer in the United States. Its instruments were in hardware stores and Sears catalogs and Montgomery Ward showrooms from Maine to California. A working musician could walk into a small-town store in 1958 and find 3 different guitars on the wall with 3 different brand names, Silvertone, Airline, Old Craftsman, and not know that every one of them had come off the same factory floor in Chicago. But the real story of Kay is not the auction. It is not the merger, and it is not the collapse. It is the story of the guitar that was never trying to be a Gibson. And for 40 years, that was precisely what made it matter. What does America owe the instrument that put music in the hands of the people who couldn't afford anything better? And what does it reveal about this country that when the answer arrived, it came in a shipping crate from Osaka? If this is the kind of American story you come here for, the factories, the craftsmanship, the sounds that shaped a century of music, subscribe to Forgotten Instruments. There are more of these stories, and none of them are being told anywhere else. The city that built Kay was not a music city in any conventional sense. Chicago in 1890 was a city of stockyards and steel mills, of immigrant labor and industrial ambition, of men who had come from Austria and Poland and Bohemia carrying trade skills that American factories had not yet learned to replicate. It was into this city, loud, cold, relentlessly commercial, that an Austrian-born luthier named Andrew Grossel set up a small instrument workshop and began building mandolins. Grossel was not trying to change American music. He was trying to make a living in a neighborhood where most men worked with their hands at something heavier than a neck blank. But Chicago in the 1890s had something that made a small instrument builder's survival possible. It had the catalog economy. Montgomery Ward had been mailing catalogs to rural American households since 1872. Sears, Roebuck followed in 1893. For a family in central Kansas or southern Mississippi with no music store within 50 miles, the catalog was the only point of contact between their household and the commercial world of instruments. Groessel's workshop, small as it was, fed into that system from its earliest years. Building instruments under whatever name a distributor required, shipping them into a country that was hungry for music and had almost no other way to get it. By 1921, Groessel's company had changed hands and changed its name. 3 men, Henry Koermeyer, Frank Voisinet, and Charles Stromberg, had bought the operation and rechristened it Stromberg-Voisinet. It was Koermeyer who understood what the company could become. A driven, politically connected figure in the Chicago instrument trade, he would later serve as president of the Chicago Zone of the Association of Musical Merchandise Manufacturers. Kurmeier saw that the catalog market was not a ceiling. It was a foundation. He wanted to build something on top of it. In 1928, with the backing of a financial investor, Kurmeier bought out his partners. He renamed the company using his own middle name, and he went looking for talent. He found it 3 miles away at Leon and Healy. At that time, one of the most respected instrument manufacturers in Chicago, a company that had been building quality stringed instruments since 1864. From Leon and Healy's workshop, Kurmeier recruited 3 luthiers, Joseph Zorzi, Philip Gabriel, and John Abbott. These were not assemblers. They were craftsmen trained in the arch-top tradition, men who understood graduated tops and proper bracing geometry and the way a pressed laminate behaved differently from a carved solid in humidity. Kurmeier brought them into his company with a specific assignment: build a guitar that a working musician would not be embarrassed to play, at a price a working musician could actually pay. By 1931, the company was formally incorporated as the K Musical Instrument Company. By 1935, a new factory had risen in Chicago, and by contemporary trade accounts, the operation was producing roughly 100,000 instruments per year. Mandolins, banjos, violins, lap steels, and guitars across a range of grades and price points, under K's own brand and under whatever house name a retailer required. Silvertone for Sears, Airline for Montgomery Ward, Old Craftsman for Spiegel, Truatone for Western Auto, the same Chicago factory, the same Chicago workers, the same Chicago Woodstock, wearing a different name on the headstock depending on who had placed the order. And in towns with no music store, no local dealer, no downtown strip with a repair bench in the back, in those towns the catalog was the only door. Kay built the instrument that stood behind it. What did an American musician have before Kay made the electric guitar affordable? In 1936, when Kay introduced its first electric model, the same year Gibson launched the ES-150, the instrument that would make Charlie Christian's name. A professional-grade American electric guitar cost more than most factory workers earned in a month. The gap between the music a working man heard on the radio and the instrument that could make it was, for most Americans, unbridgeable. Kay did not close that gap, but it made it smaller. And in the towns where the hardware store stocked the Sears catalog and the layaway book sat open under the register, smaller was everything. In 1952, Kay introduced a guitar that did not look like anything else on the American market. It was called the K161. The name meant nothing to anyone outside the factory, but the guitar itself, the thing you held in your hands, the thing you plugged into an amplifier in a rehearsal room or a roadhouse, or the back bedroom of a house in Gary, Indiana. That was something different. Players called it the Thin Twin. The name came from the instrument's 2 blade-style pickups, thin as a carpenter's rule, mounted flush against a flat-topped semi-hollow body that was neither quite an archtop nor quite a solid body, but something in between that Kay's engineers had arrived at by their own logic. Understand what a semi-hollow electric guitar actually is. The body is not solid wood throughout. It contains a chambered cavity beneath the top, which allows the wood itself to vibrate sympathetically with the strings, adding resonance and warmth that a fully solid instrument does not produce. But unlike a full hollow body archtop, the Thin Twin's design used internal parallel bracing along the top, 2 wooden braces running lengthwise, that stiffened the structure and suppressed the feedback that plagued hollow instruments when played loud. The result was an instrument that breathed like an acoustic but held together like a working tool. At moderate volume, the top moved. The tone had body. At higher volume, it stayed controlled. The pickups were unlike anything Gibson or Fender was putting in their instruments. Thin blade-style single coils, wound in-house at the Chicago factory. Not de-armand units, Not Gibson P90S, not Fender single coils, but Kay's own design, built to a specification that the company had developed through its own in-house experimentation. The attack was immediate. The sustain was moderate. The character sat between the glassy brightness of a Fender and the thick warmth of a Gibson. Not quite either, not trying to be either. In a recording environment, it cut through a mix without fighting for space. In a club, it projected without screaming. It was, in the plainest possible terms, a working musician's tool, priced at roughly $49.50 in 1952, with an optional case for $6 more, $49.50. At a moment when a Fender Telecaster carried a list price of nearly $180 and a Gibson ES-175 hollow body cost $240, the Thin Twin asked a working musician for less than a quarter of what the prestige alternatives required. For a sideman in a Chicago blues band earning $40 a weekend, that math was not academic. It was the difference between having a guitar and not having one. The instrument found its audience quickly, and its audience was not the audience Kay had built for. The Thin Twin was designed for the student market, for the beginner on layaway, for the young musician whose parents had ordered it from a catalog. What Kay did not fully anticipate was that working professional musicians, not students, not beginners, but men playing for money in front of crowds, would pick it up and find that it did something the expensive guitars did not do quite as well. At exactly the register of music that was taking over the American airwaves in the early 1950s, Chicago blues, the raw, amplified, driving sound of the South Side and the West Side clubs, the music that men like Muddy Waters and Howlin' Wolf and Jimmy Reed were building out of Mississippi Delta traditions and Chicago electricity. That music needed an instrument that was not refined. It needed an instrument that had a little roughness to it, a little snarl, a pickup that didn't clean up the attack, but gave it back with an edge. The Thin Twin did that. Nobody had planned it that way. The instrument simply was what it was. And what it was turned out to be exactly right. Is good enough its own kind of achievement? In a country that has always told itself that only the best is worth making, Kay's answer, arrived at not by design philosophy but by practical necessity, was complicated. Because what came off that Chicago factory floor in 1952 was not the best guitar in America. It was the right guitar at the right moment for the right price. And in the hands of the right musician, that turned out to be enough to change what American blues sounded like for the next 20 years. By the mid-1950s, Kay was shipping instruments to dealers in every state in the country. Not dozens of dealers, not a regional network, every state. The Sears catalog alone reached into rural communities that had never seen the inside of a music store. Farm towns in the Mississippi Delta, coal towns in eastern Kentucky, railroad towns in the Oklahoma Panhandle, where the nearest guitar shop was 100 miles of two-lane highway away. In those places, the Sears Silvertone was not a budget compromise. It was the only option. And behind the Silvertone name, behind the Montgomery Ward Airline name, behind every house brand guitar hanging in a Western Auto or a Spiegel catalog showroom, was the same Elk Grove Village factory floor, the same Chicago Craftsman, the same laminated spruce and maple bodies moving down the same production line. At its mid-decade peak, Kay was producing more guitars annually than any American manufacturer except one. The Harmony Company, also headquartered in Chicago, also feeding the same catalog economy, also invisible to most of the people who played their instruments. The two companies were the twin engines of the American student and working musician market, and they ran on the same fuel. The conviction, held by millions of American families in the post-war years, that music was worth paying for even when money was short, that a child who showed interest in a guitar deserved to hold one, that the layaway book under the hardware store counter was not a mark of poverty, but a plan. $49.50, paid out at $1 a week. That was Kay's real distribution system. Not NAM, not the flagship dealers on 48th Street in Manhattan. The layaway book, the Sears catalog, the hardware store that stocked 3 guitars between its paint and its plumbing supplies, because the owner knew that someone would ask. It was into this world, the world of the catalog guitar, the hardware store guitar, the first guitar, that Jimmy Reed walked with his KK-161 Thin Twin and recorded some of the most influential blues records of the 20th century. Reed had come to Chicago from Dunleith, Mississippi, served in the Navy, worked the steel mills in Gary, Indiana, and eventually found his way to VJ Records, the independent Chicago label that would become one of the most important R&B operations in the country. At VJ, Reed cut a string of recordings between 1953 and the mid-1960s. You don't have to go. Honest, I do. Baby, What You Want Me to Do, Big Boss Man, Bright Lights, Big City. That charted on both the Billboard R&B and Hot 100 lists simultaneously, reaching black and white audiences in a way that very few blues artists managed in that era. The guitar Reed played on those records was a K-Thin Twin, not a Gibson, not a Fender, a $49 Chicago guitar with blade pickups wound in-house at a factory that also built instruments for the Sears catalog. The sound on those records, that particular combination of immediate attack, moderate sustain, and a slightly raw mid-range character that sat perfectly in Reed's lazy, hypnotic groove, was not incidental to the music. It was the music. Bob Dylan covered Reed. The Rolling Stones covered Reed. Elvis Presley recorded several of his songs. And all of it traced back, in part, to what a K pickup did to a guitar string in a recording studio on the south side of Chicago in 1953. But Reed was not the first musician whose relationship with K had changed American music. That distinction belongs to a moment 9 years earlier in a hardware store in Tupelo, Mississippi, in January of 1946. Gladys Presley brought her 11-year-old son Elvis into the Tupelo Hardware Company that day to buy him a birthday present. The boy had asked for a bicycle. When that was out of reach, he asked for a .22 caliber rifle. Gladys Presley said no to the rifle. A store clerk named Forrest Bobo, who would write down his recollection of that afternoon 33 years later in a letter dated October 1979, retrieved a guitar from behind the display case and set a wooden box on the floor so the boy could stand on it and try the instrument at the right height. The guitar was a K flat-top acoustic. The price was $7.75 plus a 2% sales tax. Gladys Presley paid it. By most accounts, that K acoustic was the instrument Elvis Presley used through his earliest years of self-taught practice. The guitar on which he learned the chord shapes and the rhythmic strumming style that would become the physical foundation of everything that followed. When he walked into Sun's studio in Memphis in the summer of 1954 to record what would become That's All Right, the guitar in his hands is believed, by those who documented his early career most carefully, to have been that same K. The instrument that started rock and roll, in other words, cost $7.75 at a hardware store in Mississippi, and it came from a factory in Chicago that also built guitars for the Sears catalog. There is no cleaner statement of what K actually was in the American musical landscape of the mid-20th century. Not a prestige instrument, not a collector's prize. The first guitar, the guitar that got there before anything else could. The guitar that a mother bought for a boy in a hardware store because it cost less than a rifle, and it would help with his singing. Against this backdrop, against Jimmy Reed recording his VJ hits on a Thin Twin, against Elvis learning his first chords on a K flat top, the company made its one serious attempt to compete in the professional market. In 1957, K's president Sidney Katz authorized the development of the Gold K line. 3 fully hollow archtop guitars bearing the name and image of Barney Kessel, at that moment one of the most recorded jazz guitarists in America. Kessel had appeared on sessions with the Beach Boys, Sam Cooke, the Righteous Brothers, and dozens of other artists. His name on a guitar headstock carried genuine weight in professional circles. The 3 models, the Pro, the Artist, and the Jazz Special, were the most expensive instruments K had ever produced. The Jazz Special listed at $400 in 1959, the equivalent of roughly $3,300 today. They featured laminated flame maple construction, distinctive lucite batwing pickguards with Kessel's gold leaf signature, a headstock shape that players would later nickname the Kelvinator, after the refrigerators whose logo it resembled, and Kay's own Kleenex box pickups, so named for the clear plastic covers that sat over each wide, single-coil unit like a tissue dispenser mounted on a guitar. They were visually unlike anything else in an American music store in 1957. Bold, idiosyncratic, unmistakably Kay, even when trying hardest not to be. And Barney Kessel, by multiple accounts, never actually performed with them. Kay executives, according to trade history sources, had approached Kessel at a Chicago nightclub during a break in his set, handed him a prototype, and secured his endorsement on the spot. Kessel posed for promotional photographs. His signature went on the headstock. His name went into the catalogs. But Kessel, according to anecdotal evidence documented in at least one biography, reportedly considered the instruments poor and continued performing on his Gibson ES 350 throughout the endorsement period. The K Gold K line lasted approximately 3 years before the Kessel models quietly disappeared from the catalog around 1960. What is an endorsement actually worth when the man whose name is on the instrument won't play it on a stage? Kay had purchased a famous name. It had not purchased a famous sound. The distinction mattered more than the company understood in 1957, because the professional market it was trying to enter was exactly the market where musicians listened most carefully to what other musicians actually played, not what their signatures said they played. The Gold K experiment was not a catastrophe. The instruments sold. They found players who genuinely valued them, and in the decades since, the surviving examples have become among the most sought-after vintage K guitars on the collector market, bought not for Kessel's name but for their own particular sound and visual character. But as a strategic move, as Kay's bid to be taken seriously by the professional tier, it revealed the limits of a company that had built its identity on accessibility and was now trying to buy credibility. It had not earned note by note. The working musician already knew what K was. The catalog already told the truth. What the Gold K line wanted to say was something different. And the market, in its quiet way, declined to believe it. The Japanese guitars arrived quietly. Not all at once. Not with a press release or a trade announcement or a warning in the pages of Billboard. They arrived the way most disruptions arrive in manufacturing industries. In small increments, through secondary channels, at price points that no one took seriously until the moment they had to. A Tasco-built guitar landing in a Montgomery Ward showroom in 1963, listed at $34. A Kingston-branded instrument in a Spiegel catalog the following season, $28 with a starter amplifier included. Instruments that looked, from a distance, like what Kay had been building for 30 years. Laminated bodies, basic electronics, entry-level appointments, but built at a fraction of the labor cost that the Chicago factory carried. At first, the American trade press was dismissive. The quality was rough, the fretwork was inconsistent, the tuning machine slipped. Any experienced player could tell the difference between a Chicago-built K and a Japanese import within 30 seconds of picking one up. The problem was that the people buying student-grade guitars in 1963 were not by definition experienced players. They were beginners. They were parents buying a first guitar for a child. They were the same customers who had been ordering from the Sears catalog for 20 years. And Sears, which had built its instrument business on K-manufactured Silvertones, was paying close attention to the numbers. By 1965, those numbers had shifted enough that Sidney Katz made a decision. He sold K to the Seeburg Corporation. Seeburg was not a music company. It was a jukebox manufacturer, one of the dominant forces in the coin-operated entertainment business, a company that understood volume production and retail distribution but had never employed a luthier, never spec'd a pickup, never stood on a factory floor while a craftsman set a neck angle by hand. Seeburg acquired Kay the way conglomerates acquired instrument companies throughout that decade, as a cash-generating division, a line item in a diversified portfolio, a business to be optimized rather than understood. Katz himself stayed on as head of Seeburg's musical instrument division, a title that sounded like continuity but functioned more like management of a withdrawal. Under Seeburg, Kay continued to produce. The factory in Elk Grove Village kept running. The catalogs kept listing the instruments. But the decisions being made were no longer being made by people who had spent their careers inside the instrument trade. They were being made by people whose primary frame of reference was coin-operated jukeboxes, whose definition of a successful product was one that reduced cost per unit while maintaining sufficient retail velocity to justify the floor space. The craftsmen on the factory floor noticed. The dealers noticed. The trade press, in its careful way, began to notice. 2 years after Seeburg acquired Kay, the corporation sold it again. The buyer was Valco. This is the moment the story turns strange. Stranger than a simple acquisition. Stranger than a straightforward decline. Valco was not a conglomerate. It was not a jukebox company. It was a Chicago guitar and amplifier manufacturer, the company behind the National and Supro brand names, a competitor that had shared the same retail channels as Kay for 20 years. And it was, as it had been for the better part of a decade, the company that had been quietly building Kay's amplifiers, manufacturing the gear that Kay sold under its own name, filling orders from the factory on the north side, while Kay's Elk Grove Village operation focused on guitars. The two rivals had been commercially entangled for years before anyone called it a merger. When Valco formally acquired Kay in 1967, the trade press described it as a consolidation. What it actually was, in operational terms, was two companies that had each been weakened by the same force, the accelerating quality and falling price of Japanese imports. Attempting to find in combination the strength that neither had retained separately, it did not work. Valco's own finances were deteriorating. The Japanese instruments that had undercut Kay's student-grade market had done equal damage to Valco's National and Supro lines. Inventory accumulated, debt mounted. The combined entity, operating briefly under the Valco name with Kay's headstock logo replaced by Valco's own, could not generate the revenue needed to service what the merger had cost. Within a year of the acquisition, it was over. The factory went quiet in 1968. Not with a press release, not with a statement to the trade press. The production line stopped. The craftsmen who had spent careers setting necks and winding pickups and pressing laminated tops collected their final checks and left. The tooling sat, the jigs sat, the woodstock sat in a building in Elk Grove Village, while lawyers sorted out what remained of two companies that had between them put more guitars into American hands than almost anyone else in the history of the instrument trade. In October of 1969, the auctioneer came. The bass and cello line was purchased by a former Valco employee who formed a new company called Engelhart Link and continued production at the same Elk Grove Village address, the one thread of genuine craft continuity that survived the dissolution. The one part of what Kay had built that kept moving through trained hands rather than being broken up for scrap. Everything else went to the highest bidder. The Kay name itself was acquired by Weiss Musical Instruments, a Chicago import operation run by Sylvan Weindling and Barry Hornstein, who had been distributing Japanese-built Teisco guitars in the American market. They paid for the name. They did not pay for the factory, the tooling, the workforce, or the methods. By 1973, the Kay logo was appearing on the headstocks of Teisco-built instruments imported from Japan, the same category of product that the imported price competition had used to destroy the original Kay company in the first place. The name survived. The instrument did not. The Sears catalog kept running. The layaway books were still open under hardware store counters across the country, but the guitars in them were no longer built in Chicago by men trained in the archtop tradition, no longer wound with pickups developed in-house on the north side, no longer pressed from wood stock sourced through a supply chain that Chicago craftsmen had spent 40 years refining. The stamp on the headstock said K. The factory it came from was in Osaka. The K name has never entirely disappeared. After Weiss Musical Instruments finished badge engineering Japanese Tisco guitars under the K logo through the 1970s, the trademark passed to a series of subsequent owners, each one further from Chicago, each one less connected to anything that had happened in that Elk Grove Village factory. In 1980, a businessman named Tony Blair purchased the K trademark through his company AR Enterprises, and eventually began attaching it to a new line of imported instruments. In 2008 and 2009, the K Guitar Company of California reissued 12 vintage-inspired models manufactured by Fritz Brothers Guitars. The current reissue catalog includes the Thin Twin, the Barney Kessel Archtops, and the Pro Bass. Instruments built to approximate the look and feel of the 1950s originals, manufactured offshore, sold to a market that has decided the K aesthetic is worth preserving even if the K factory is not. This is the hollow revival in its clearest American form. The name is continuous. The instrument is not. The collector market has already rendered its verdict, and it has done so without sentiment. A clean, original KK161 Thin Twin from the early 1950s, the guitar Jimmy Reed made famous, the guitar that cost $49.50 new, now sells on Reverb and eBay for anywhere between $400 and $1,200 depending on condition, originality, and the particular character of its pickups. A Gold K. Barney Kessel Jazz Special in excellent original condition commands considerably more, upward of $2,000 in recent completed listings, for an instrument that Barney Kessel reportedly considered too poor to play on a stage. The collector market has a sense of humor that the original management lacked. The vintage guitar community has built an entire archaeology around K. Dedicated researchers, among them S. Nathaniel Adams, whose identification guides remain the most precise dating tools available for these instruments, have spent years cataloging the foil labels, the pickup variations, the headstock evolutions, the subtle changes in binding specification that allow a knowledgeable buyer to place a K guitar within a 2-year production window without a single document from the company itself. K never published its internal serial number system. The instruments have had to be decoded from the outside in by people who love them enough to do the work the company never did. At the address of the original Elk Grove Village factory, there is no monument, no historical marker. The building that housed the final years of K and Valco production has long since been repurposed into the light industrial anonymity that characterizes most of the suburban Chicago manufacturing corridor. Loading docks, warehouse leases, the kind of architecture that does not announce what it replaced. Chicago itself has a Made in Chicago museum that acknowledges K's place in the city's manufacturing history. It is not the same as the factory still standing. The one genuine thread of continuity that survived the 1969 auction ran through the bass and cello line. Engelhart Link, formed by a former Valco employee who bought the upright bass tooling at the asset auction, continued building instruments at the same Elk Grove Village address for decades. The KS9 Swingmaster bass becoming the Engelhart ES9, the same instrument under a different name, still American-made, still used by students and touring jazz and bluegrass musicians who needed a working upright that could take the road. In 2019, Upton Bass String Instrument Company purchased the bass and cello making equipment from Engelhart Link. The tooling that Gladys Presley's $7.75 had in some distant and indirect way helped to sustain the tooling from the factory that built the instrument Elvis first held, is still being used to make instruments in Illinois today. That is not a legacy that announces itself, but it is a real one. Here's the surprise the story leaves behind. The most famous guitar Kay ever built was not the Barney Kessel Jazz Special, with its $400 price tag and its hollow endorsement. It was not the Thin Twin. For all that Jimmy Reed made it immortal, it was a flat-top acoustic that cost $7.75 at a hardware store in Tupelo, Mississippi, in January of 1946, an instrument so inexpensive that it almost wasn't worth keeping track of. Bought by a woman who could not afford a bicycle and thought a guitar might help her son with his singing. That guitar is believed to have been in Elvis Presley's hands when he walked into Sun's studio 8 years later. The instrument that arguably initiated the chain of events leading to the most consequential cultural explosion in 20th century American music cost less than a week's groceries and came from a factory that the American music industry never quite took seriously. What does that tell us about how America values the things it makes? The instrument trade has always organized itself around the prestige end, the carved tops, the premium tone woods, the name brand endorsers who appear in full-page advertisements in the back pages of Downbeat. Kay lived at the other end of that spectrum for its entire existence, and at the other end it outsold almost everyone. When the market shifted and the cheap alternative arrived from overseas, no one wrote an editorial about what was lost. No musician held a press conference. The factory in Elk Grove Village closed without a public statement, and the trade press moved on to the next season's NAMM announcements. The verdict of the collector market, arrived at 50 years later, is the only institutional acknowledgement Kay ever received that its work had mattered. The prices on Reverb say what the industry never bothered to say when it was still possible to say it with something other than money. Somewhere in America tonight, in the back room of a pawn shop or the corner of an attic or a church basement where someone's uncle left a guitar decades ago, there is almost certainly a Kay. It does not know who made it or why or what happened to the factory. It knows what it was built to do. And if the pickups still work